Hi, my name is Reid. I'm a psychotherapist in San Francisco, California, and today I'd like to talk about the value of surrendering hope that a narcissistic abuser can change. In the course of working towards surrendering the hope that one's narcissistic abuser, whether it's a partner or a parent or even a family system, can change, is that there's sort of a loss in that, and often a long-held hope that the next time the narcissistic abuser might offer them what one hopes they will finally provide. And that loss, though, if it's sort of not moved away from and the accompanying feelings get to be sort of tolerated, I think there can be a tremendous amount to gain in terms of feeling more connected to oneself and freer to identify, find, and really enjoy relationships that feel much more reciprocal, mutually protective, and nourishing to one another. And so in today's video, I want to talk about how it gets to be so that we, in recovering from a narcissistic abuser, may continue to seek the change from that abuser that has been so not forthcoming, because I think there's some good kind of psychological developmental reasons for that. And then to illustrate some of the process of giving up that hope and kind of what challenges could therein lie in the process, but that ultimately I think can be very beneficial to the person in recovery from this form of abuse. So like in a lot of these videos, I think it's often important to kind of go to the origin of when someone encounters a narcissistic person with whom they are thrust into a relationship with. And I think often the best scenario for that is for a child born to a narcissistic parent. So I'll sort of start there again. And, just to kind of quickly offer a synopsis of the dilemma faced by the child in these circumstances is that their parent is someone who I think starts with a core sense of deep worthlessness, that rather than it being kind of addressed and, help being sought for that, this person's personality is sort of developed to deny that worthlessness and in fact insist on its opposite. That instead of the worthlessness they feel, they are in fact the opposite, better, superior, more special than others. And to such a degree that sense of worthlessness can even be unconscious and wholeheartedly denied by the narcissistic individual. But in their behaviors and ease of being slighted, I think that's kind of where that worthlessness kind of rears its head in their kind of psychology. So there's not only sort of the insistence on the opposite of being worthless, but also a sense of entitlement that others comply with that sense of superiority or grandiosity. And in the case of a child born to a narcissistic parent, it's likely that child's going to need to comply with that parent's sense of entitlement. And that grows very tricky for the child when they, age to around age 2 to 5, where they develop appropriately their own sense of will and initiative, because that likely will be experienced as not complying with the narcissistic parent's sense of entitlement. So the child sort of faces this dilemma of like being, again, programmed to kind of receive non-possessive care, support, attention, involvement in their lives, and they're sort of looking at a parent who's looking at the child in a psychological way of saying, the parent's asking the child, what can you do for me? And the child's sort of programmed to say, no, like what you're supposed to be doing for me. But the parent holds the ace card here, because ultimately, from a survival standpoint, the child needs the parent more than the parent needs the child. So the child's got to be the one to kind of adjust themselves to, in essence, meet those demands from the narcissistic parent of offering to that parent what he or she needs from the child, and finding a way to stow away the hurt, feelings of rejection, shame that the child must then bear, and finding a way to sort of maintain the face needed, sort of often a shining sort of face of gratitude and appreciation towards this narcissistic parent, because that is what that parent often requires. Importantly in this dynamic, and maybe it's obvious, but the parent is the only game in town that the child has to kind of know who they are, get what they believe is necessary to sort of develop their own sense of themselves and who they are in the world. And when that is very much lacking, which it sort of is with a narcissistic parent, the reflex for the child is not to go elsewhere and like find another adult who's much more well-adjusted and able to offer what is needed. That's not how our sort of, I think, biologically ordained attachment motivations and drives work. We instead have to sort of double down and hunker down with that narcissistic parent. And there's a book called Leaving Home by David Solani that is a tremendous resource that I highly recommend to people. And he makes the really incredibly, I think, important point that children who have suffered neglect and abuse and thereby deficits in their relationship towards their parents often feel a much stronger attachment to those same parents, not just during childhood, but beyond, like into adulthood, than children who've been sort of parented by good enough parents. Because in those cases, when a child has had a good enough parent, they've been given to enough by those parents that they kind of consolidate their own sense of self in the world that isn't over time, with enough accrual of such kind of experiences and recognition of who that child is independently, non-possessively in the world, the child has what he or she needs, or they have, I've heard it also described as the backpack, or like pot of gold. I think maybe Pete Walker calls it that. The pot of gold of the self that they get to kind of have and carry around. And as a result, the act of separating, healthy separation from one's family of origin in these sort of good enough parent scenarios is just a natural course of action that is not hard for the child to do, and is in fact typically supported by these attentive enough and loving enough parents. And so it's paradoxically the opposite with, in essence, deficient parents, which narcissistic parents tend to be for the child, because the child sort of has been, I think, in my sense, traumatized by the threat of abandonment and actually experience of emotional abandonment they had to endure, and the kind of chronic deprivation of being given to what was needed to form that sort of independent self in the world that they needed to look to these parents to provide. And so the reflex to keep looking to or eking out that what was needed from these narcissistic parents can be very, very strong, and a reflex that can, I think, very much be worked with in recovery from this type of, talking about today, childhood narcissistic abuse, so that one gets to earn for themselves that kind of pot of gold within the self, or kind of an independent sense of oneself as they kind of work through and leave the relationships that were so depriving in their childhood. In the course of leaving, there's also the kind of correlate, which is finding, like we talked before, about safe people, safe relationships, where things don't have to be striven for in relationship, the necessary essential things. In fact, rather, one is given to freely, and and then that's easily reciprocated, and there's a sense of availability for what is needed pretty consistently. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the kind of specific configurations of the child's self that may have to come into being in order to get through a childhood with a narcissistic parent that is is going to be rife with, these wounds I've mentioned before of feeling rejected, the hurt that comes along with finding cruelty or contempt, where kindness and support is sort of biologically programmed to be expected, and being able to act in ways with that parent which minimizes the damage that parent can do and retains the child's hope that this next time or sometime in the future they can get what is so desperately needed by that parent. And so again, in Solani's book, he talks about the configuration of the self kind of starting with a wounded self. And that's a part of one's experience that kind of holds all those, the feelings of rejection, of feeling less than, maybe worthless, defective. And those feelings that are sort of honestly come by in relationship to a narcissistic parent who's often treating the child in a very devalued way, unless the child is sort of serving that parent's kind of entitled narcissistic interests. The child senses that. They know that on their own they are not being recognized, appreciated, and encouraged. And there's pain involved. And that's sort of what can get stored in this wounded self. But that wounded self poses a threat to the kind of the harmony that the child must strike with a narcissistic parent, where that child needs to keep showing that parent they're appreciated, at least not show the child's honest reaction to how hurtful the parent's parenting is for that child. That can be on behalf of the parent, and or the parent, if they have a sadistic streak, that could actually please the parent to see how much they're hurting the child too, which would be another injury to the child. So it could be a variety of reasons why it might be necessary to keep the wounded self secret, both from the parent and in the child's psychology from the child, him or herself. And so in those cases, it can kind of be pushed out of conscious awareness. Then what needs to kind of occupy center stage in a conscious manner for the child is a hopeful self. And that hopeful self is sort of the one that says, no, I can get what I need from mom or dad, and sort of denies the other feelings that are there necessarily, that are harbored by the wounded self. It's the continual sort of reification of the hopeful self's mission of kind of being able to remain oblivious to the rejection that's the wounded self is feeling and knows deeply, in order to stay attendant and seeking of the acceptance and company of these very deficient narcissistic parents. In essence, the hopeful self is working to convince the child that the next time, say, they are with the parent or at some point in the future, the parent will be who they wish the parent will be who the child wishes they would be, rather than the parent that I think the wounded self knows they actually are. And this is an important configuration because it lets the child keep going. It protects the child from the sort of annihilating terror of knowing how truly abandoned they are by the people who sort of feel early in life like the only other people in the world to that child. So it is, again, critical to survival to kind of retain the hope that what feels so bad right now can change the next day, like I guess in the musical Annie, in essence, that the sun will come out tomorrow, despite so much evidence to the contrary, because it's necessary to keep believing that at that phase in life, when the parents truly are the only game in town for the child. And I wanted to lay this out because I think it can be helpful to understand this sort of adaptive configuration of the self once recovery from this kind of abuse becomes possible. In Solani's book, the notion of leaving home in a literal sense of sort of separating from one's very depriving family of origin for that child, often headed by a narcissistic parent, and literally, and say going limited to no contact, but also psychologically, finding relationships that offer what is needed freely and make available what is needed, and sort of have a different template than what was known in the family of origin, and similarly leaving relationships that ascribe to that old template in the search of, again, relationships that offer the presence of safety, which we've discussed. And in the course of doing that, it can be useful, I think, as one kind of registers what it feels like internally, to leave, again, literally or psychologically, a home that was sort of a broken home in this regard. That will be a tremendous, a lot of things, but disappointment, blow to that hopeful self. That's, that younger part that needs to and has usefully thought that the only way to save themselves from this predicament is to get their parents to be other than who they are. And so finding ways to kind of like attend to that part of ourselves that has had to believe there's no other option but our own parents, and work with that part, again, in a sort of gentle, empathic, supportive way, to sort of say like, hey, if you detach from these people, and work with maybe some of the guilt that ensues, that there's so much more to gain out there in relationships where what is wished for or was wished for with this parent can be actually provided. It just may not be by that parent. Similarly, as that occurs, the wounded self has more room to sort of breathe and come up. And that's where I think therapy or very, very safe, sturdy other relationships or friendships can be very also helpful, because it allows one to kind of know and attend to the wounds that were in fact incurred in that relationship and growing up. And by virtue of doing that, it can really inform the search for safety after sort of leaving home, as it were, because now there's no sort of illusion that it wasn't as hurtful as it actually was to be in relationship to one's family of origin. And again, that piece of the configuration is maybe one element of this process of leaving home and being able to kind of make sense of what one is experiencing and offer, in essence, guidance to oneself within in working towards, leaving a relationship where one did not feel the way they want to feel with another person, and finding relationships where that is readily available. This can help to sort of reprogram internally what might keep one oriented towards the sort of bad old, and repurposing the hope that was in that direction towards much more deserving sources and objects. Well, I hope today's video was of some use in terms of another feature of, in essence, really working towards finding safe people after one has known or has had to be in relationship, often chronically, to very unsafe people. And again, thank you for your continued support, encouragement of these videos and of each other. It really means a tremendous amount to me, and it certainly seems like it does to each other as you're sort of supportive of each other too. So it's been such a meaningful and worthwhile project, and I wish everyone well, and we'll post another video next Sunday at 9 a.m. Pacific time. Take care.